In 1924, Katharine Reynolds died at age 44, leaving behind a self-sufficient estate, employing 300 workers. A 64-room mansion, 1,067 acres. Model dairy, greenhouses growing orchids in North Carolina, private power plant and golf course. Some called it progressive, others saw exploitation. The estate represented the New South's promised modernization and enlightened management. But Reynolda was built on tobacco wealth. The fortune came from cigarettes killing millions. Construction killed workers whose names were never recorded. Progressive ideals applied only to whites. Black workers earned half the wages, lived in segregated housing, had children excluded from the estate school. Now it's a museum, celebrating architecture and philanthropy. The interpretation rarely mentions the exploitation. If you're fascinated by estates built on dark foundations and stories historic sites don't tell, subscribe. Tell me in the comments which Southern estate we should investigate next. Now, let's discover how tobacco fortune built a kingdom on worker suffering. Chapter 1. The Tobacco Fortune. Winston-Salem in the 1,880 seconds represented the New South's industrial transformation. The town sat at railroad intersections, connecting Virginia tobacco fields to southern ports. After the Civil War, processing plants replaced plantations as wealth sources. Small manufacturers competed for market share. Most failed within a decade. A few survived through ruthless efficiency and willingness to exploit every advantage post-Reconstruction offered. Cheap labor, minimal regulation, a workforce with no alternatives. Richard Joshua Reynolds arrived in Winston in 1874 with $7,500 borrowed from his father. He was 24 years old. He rented a factory building and hired 12 workers. The first year produced 150,000 pounds of chewing tobacco. The product competed by undercutting prices. Reynolds sold cheaper because he paid workers less and extended hours beyond what northern factories required. By 1880, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco employed 60 workers and produced over 500,000 pounds annually. The workforce consisted primarily of black laborers recently freed from slavery. They received wages roughly half what white workers earned for identical tasks. Women and children worked alongside men. The youngest workers were perhaps 8 years old. They stripped tobacco leaves, sorted stems, hauled materials. The work destroyed lungs within years. Tobacco dust filled the air constantly. Workers breathed it for 12-hour shifts 6 days weekly. Reynolds understood labor was his competitive advantage. Northern manufacturers faced unions and safety regulations. Southern manufacturers faced neither. Workers who complained found themselves replaced within hours. Men who could no longer work simply left. New workers filled positions the same day. By 1890, Reynolds Tobacco employed over 400 workers, producing 5 million pounds annually. The competition came primarily from James Buchanan Duke's American Tobacco Company in Durham. Duke was larger and better capitalized. He pioneered cigarette manufacturing using rolling machines. Reynolds focused on chewing tobacco and plug tobacco, requiring more hand labor but commanding loyal markets. Reynolds expanded throughout the 1,890 seconds by purchasing smaller competitors. He invested in machinery, reducing labor requirements while increasing output. He introduced new brands targeting different markets. By 1900, Reynolds Tobacco was the South's second-largest manufacturer. The workers who made this growth possible remained invisible in company presentations. Advertisements showed happy farmers and satisfied customers. They never depicted factory floors where men, women, and children worked in conditions destroying bodies systematically. Success rested on maintaining wages as low as possible and conditions as harsh as workers would tolerate. Labor organizing attempts occurred periodically. In 1894, white workers attempted forming a union demanding reduced hours and increased wages. Reynolds fired them immediately. He hired replacements the same day. The effort collapsed within a week. Workers understood collective action meant unemployment. Child labor remained standard despite laws technically restricting it. Factory inspectors occasionally visited but rarely enforced regulations. Reynolds maintained good relationships with local officials through strategic donations. The children working 12-hour shifts generated no official concern. Their wages often meant the difference between families eating or going hungry. The racial hierarchy within factories was explicit. Black workers occupied the lowest-paid, most dangerous positions. They hauled materials, cleaned equipment, performed tasks. White workers refused. White workers operated machinery and held supervisory roles. The wage differential was unquestioned. Black workers earned approximately 40 cents daily. White workers in comparable positions earned 75 cents to $1. Management positions were exclusively white. Women worked primarily in sorting and packaging. They earned less than men performing identical work. Sexual harassment by supervisors was routine. Women who refused advances found hours reduced or employment terminated. Those who complied discovered compliance guaranteed nothing. The power imbalance made resistance impossible. By 1907, Reynolds Tobacco employed 2,500 workers, producing 25 million pounds annually. Reynolds had become one of the South's wealthiest men. He was 57, unmarried, living in a modest downtown residence. Katharine Smith was born in 1,880 inches Mount Airy, 32 years after Reynolds. Her family occupied the middle tier of Southern society. She received education unusual for Southern women, attending schools through high school and completing studies at a Virginia female academy. The education qualified her to teach. She taught school in Mount Airy for several years. The work paid minimal wages. Teaching offered no path to financial security. Marriage remained the only realistic avenue to economic stability. She met Reynolds through her brother, who worked in Reynolds Tobacco. The introduction occurred at a company event in 1904. Reynolds was 54. Katharine was 24. The age difference was notable but not scandalous when wealthy older men commonly married younger women. They married the 27th of February 1905. The wedding was modest. They moved into Reynolds's residence at 666 West 5th Street. Reynolds continued spending 12 to 14 hours daily at the factory. Katharine assumed household management. Within 2 years, Katharine produced 2 children. Mary was born in 1906, Richard Jr. in 1907. But Katharine possessed ambitions beyond childbearing. She understood true social standing required physical manifestation of wealth through architecture and land. She began advocating for a proper estate. Reynolds resisted initially, but Katharine persisted. She argued their children deserved proper upbringing. She pointed to other tobacco families building estates. By 1909, Reynolds yielded. The search took 2 years. In 1911, Reynolds found 1,067 acres 5 miles north of the city. He purchased the land in 1912 for $48,000. Nancy arrived in 1910, Zachary in 1911. With 4 children and estate plans, Katharine had secured her position. Chapter 2. The Young Wife and the Vision. Charles Barton Keene arrived in Winston-Salem in 1912 with credentials that impressed Katharine Reynolds. He had trained at the University of Pennsylvania's architecture program. He had established a Philadelphia practice serving wealthy clients. His portfolio included large residential projects and country estates. He specialized in Georgian Revival and Colonial Revival styles. Initial meetings established the project's parameters. Katharine wanted a Georgian Revival mansion appropriate to Reynolds' family status. The design should reference English country houses but incorporate modern American conveniences. The estate should be entirely self-sufficient. R.J. wanted agricultural operations demonstrating progressive-era farming methods. Both agreed the estate should make a statement about what the New South could achieve. Keene spent months developing preliminary plans. He identified the optimal mansion site on elevated ground. He planned locations for supporting buildings, including barns, greenhouses, power plant, worker housing, and recreational facilities. His initial designs called for approximately 20 major structures beyond the main house. The mansion design evolved through multiple iterations. Keene's early proposals were substantial but modest. Katharine pushed for something grander. She wanted 60 or more rooms. She wanted guest suites for extended visitors. She wanted entertainment spaces suitable for hosting significant social events. The house should demonstrate that Southern estates could match anything found in the North. The architectural style Keene proposed was Georgian Revival, executed with careful attention to proportion and detail. The exterior would feature red brick manufactured specially for the project. White painted wood trim would provide contrast. The overall effect would suggest a substantial English country house transplanted to North Carolina. Keene incorporated Katharine's progressive-era ideals into estate planning. Worker housing would be substantial and sanitary. The village would include running water, electricity, and indoor plumbing. A school would serve workers' children. But the progressive vision operated within rigid boundaries. The worker village would be racially segregated. Black workers would occupy separate housing away from white workers. The school would serve only white children. The agricultural plans were elaborate. R.J. wanted to demonstrate that scientific farming methods could succeed in the South. The estate would include dairy barns housing purebred Guernsey cattle. Hog operations would raise prize-winning animals. Vegetable gardens would supply the household. A large lake would support recreation and provide irrigation water. The greenhouse complex Keene designed was particularly ambitious. Multiple connected structures would allow year-round production of flowers, tropical fruits, and exotic plants. The greenhouses would rival commercial operations in size and sophistication. The power plant design reflected R.J.'s commitment to modernity. The estate would generate its own electricity using coal-fired steam engines. Self-sufficiency meant not depending on external infrastructure. By early 1914, Keene had completed final drawings. The project would cost approximately $300,000 for the mansion alone. The total estate cost would approach $5 million. In 1914 currency, that represented extraordinary expenditure. Adjusted for inflation, the project would cost approximately $140 million today. Winston-Salem in 1912 operated according to rules more rigid than legal code. The city had emerged from the Civil War with racial hierarchies firmly re-established. Jim Crow laws passed in the 1,890 seconds codified what custom had already determined. Black residents could not vote, serve on juries, attend white schools, or occupy public spaces designated for whites. The separation was absolute. The white population maintained its own internal hierarchies. Tobacco manufacturers occupied the apex. Below them came professionals. Skilled craftsmen occupied the middle tier. Factory workers formed the base of white social structure. Within tobacco factories, the hierarchy was explicit. Management positions went exclusively to white men from established families. Skilled positions operating machinery were reserved for white workers. Unskilled positions went to black workers. The wage structure reflected these divisions precisely. White supervisors earned $15 to $20 weekly. Skilled white workers received $8 to $12. Unskilled white laborers earned $5 to $8. Black workers performing identical tasks earned $3 to $5 weekly. Women earned $3 to $6 regardless of skill. Housing patterns replicated workplace segregation. White workers lived in neighborhoods east and south of factories. Black workers lived west of downtown in areas lacking paved streets, trash collection, and consistent water service. Schools reflected the same divisions. Winston-Salem operated separate systems for white and black children. White schools received substantially more funding per student. Black schools operated in older buildings with inadequate supplies. Labor organizing faced brutal suppression. White workers who attempted unionizing found themselves blacklisted. Organizers from outside Winston-Salem were run out of town. Black workers who attempted collective action faced worse. Katharine Reynolds considered herself progressive by her time's standards. She supported education. She believed in sanitation and public health. But her progressivism never questioned racial segregation. She accepted as natural that black and white people should occupy separate spaces, perform different work, and receive different compensation. The estate design reflected hierarchies Katharine and R.J. assumed were permanent. The worker village would house approximately 100 families. White workers would occupy better constructed homes closer to main facilities. Black workers would live in more basic structures farther from central estate buildings. Katharine believed she was treating workers generously. The houses she planned were superior to what factory workers typically occupied. They would have electricity, running water, and indoor plumbing. By 1912 Winston-Salem standards, Katharine was providing enlightened conditions. But the Enlightenment had limits. Workers would remain workers. They would live where told, work hours required, and accept wages management determined. The housing created dependence. Workers who lost employment also lost housing immediately. The recreational facilities operated on the same principles. A baseball diamond would allow workers to form teams. Swimming would be permitted during designated hours. The golf course was exclusively for the Reynolds family and guests. Groundbreaking was scheduled for June 1914. Construction of Reynolds proceeded in stages designed to establish essential infrastructure before beginning mansion work. Ground was broken in June 1914. The first priority was the power plant. Without independent electricity generation, other construction would be delayed during winter when daylight hours were limited. The power plant structure rose throughout summer 1914. Workers excavated foundations to bedrock. They installed concrete footings designed to support heavy machinery. The building frame used structural steel fabricated in Pennsylvania. Brick walls went up in August. The roof was completed in September. By October, workers were installing boilers, steam engines, and electrical generators. The workforce numbered approximately 100 men working 6-day weeks. Skilled positions went to white workers, including masons, carpenters, and electricians. Black workers hauled materials, excavated foundations, and performed tasks requiring physical strength but no specialized training. The racial division was absolute. Wages reflected the hierarchy. White skilled workers earned $3 to $4 daily. White unskilled laborers received $1.50 to $2. Black workers performing identical tasks to white unskilled labor earned $1 to $1.25 daily. The work week was 6 days. Workers put in 10 to 12 hours per shift. Working conditions followed standards of the era, which prioritized speed over safety. Scaffolding rose along building walls constructed from rough lumber and rope. Workers climbed ladders carrying tools and materials. Falls happened with predictable frequency. A worker fell from the power plant roof in August 1914 while installing slate tiles. He struck the ground after dropping 40 feet. Other workers carried him to a wagon. He died before reaching the hospital. Construction paused for perhaps 2 hours. Work resumed. No investigation followed. His widow received no compensation. The materials themselves presented hazards. Cement dust caused respiratory problems. Lime burned exposed skin. Workers handled materials without gloves or protective equipment. Chemical burns were common. Serious burns became infected. No medical facilities existed at the construction site. The power plant became operational in December 1914. Electric lighting extended working hours. Power tools reduced labor requirements. The plant's generators produced enough electricity for the entire estate. But the cost had been measured and worker suffering no one documented. Dairy barn construction began in early 1915. The complex would house 30 to 40 Guernsey cattle in conditions superior to typical farm animals. Each cow would have an individual stall. Floors would be poured concrete with drainage systems. Ventilation would prevent ammonia buildup. Workers excavated foundations throughout winter 1915. The work was brutal. January temperatures dropped below freezing regularly. Workers broke through frozen ground using picks and shovels. The excavation required removing thousands of cubic yards of clay. Horse-drawn wagons hauled material. The soil was heavy. Loading and unloading was backbreaking labor. The dairy barn superstructure rose in spring 1915. Carpenters framed the building using lumber milled on site. A sawmill had been established near the estate's forested area. Trees were felled, bucked into logs, and processed into boards. The sawmill operation was dangerous. Circular saw blades operated without guards. At least 2 workers suffered amputations during 1915. Neither received compensation. Both were replaced immediately. Brickwork began in June 1915. Bricks were manufactured at kilns near Winston-Salem. Masons laid approximately 500,000 bricks over several months. The work required skill and stamina. Masons worked from scaffolding in summer heat, exceeding 95 degrees. They lifted heavy bricks repeatedly throughout 10-hour shifts. The physical toll accumulated. Men in their 30 seconds moved like people decades older. By age 45, most masons could no longer perform the work. The greenhouse complex construction began in fall 1915. The structures would eventually cover approximately 30,000 square feet. Steel framework would support glass panels. The design was sophisticated. Implementation was hazardous. Workers erected steel frames at heights up to 30 feet. Welders worked without eye protection, beyond crude goggles. Arc flashes damaged vision permanently. Glass installation proceeded through winter 1915 and spring 1916. Shattered glass caused cuts requiring stitching. Infections followed. Workers who developed lockjaw symptoms usually died. The deaths were attributed to infection without connecting them to workplace conditions. The lake construction began in 1916. Creating a 10-acre lake required damming a stream and excavating substantial earth volumes. Workers built a dam using stone and concrete. The excavation proceeded throughout summer 1916. Workers toiled in mud and water. Several developed severe respiratory infections that progressed to pneumonia. At least one died. By late 1916, attention shifted to the mansion site. The foundation excavation required removing thousands of cubic yards of red clay. The clay was dense and difficult to work. Workers broke through it slowly. The excavation took months. Rain filled the pit repeatedly. Workers baled water by hand. Foundation construction proceeded through winter 1916 and into 1917. Concrete was mixed on site. Cold weather complicated the process. Concrete that froze before curing would be compromised. Workers sometimes labored through nights maintaining fires near fresh pours. The steel framework arrived in spring 1917. Erecting steel required coordinating deliveries, positioning heavy beams, and connecting everything according to precise specifications. Workers operated hoisting equipment while standing on beams at considerable heights. A worker fell from second-floor framing in May 1917. He was positioning a beam when his footing gave way. The fall was approximately 25 feet. He died within minutes. His body was removed. Work continued that afternoon. His name has been lost. By July 1918, the mansion's exterior was essentially complete. Brickwork was finished. The roof was on. Windows were installed. But hundreds of tasks remained. Interior, plaster, flooring, woodwork, painting, mechanical systems, electrical wiring, and plumbing all required completion. R.J. Reynolds would never see it finished. On the 30th of July 1918, he died at age 68. Katharine was 38 with 4 children and decisions to make. Chapter 4. Building the Kingdom. The mansion at Rinalda was completed during 1919 under Katharine's direction after R.J.'s death. Katharine pushed completion aggressively throughout late 1918 and into 1919. The house occupied approximately 16,000 square feet across 2 main floors and a full basement. The design followed Georgian Revival principles, with central block and symmetrical wings. The exterior featured handmade red brick laid in Flemish bond pattern, white-painted wood trim framed windows. The slate roof was dark gray, imported from Vermont. The first floor contained formal public spaces. The entrance hall opened onto a central corridor. A formal living room measured 30 feet by 25 feet with 12-foot ceilings. Tall windows provided southern light. To the right, a formal dining room of similar dimensions could accommodate 20 guests. Built-in cabinets displayed china and silver. The library occupied the southeast corner. Floor-to-ceiling bookcases covered 2 walls. A large desk sat before windows overlooking gardens. The room had served as R.J.'s office. After his death, Katharine used it for managing estate business. The music room balanced the library on the opposite side. Katharine played piano competently and wanted space for musical entertainment. A Steinway grand piano occupied one corner. The second floor contained family bedrooms and guest suites. Katharine's bedroom suite occupied the southeast corner with private bathroom. Each child had individual bedrooms. Guest suites numbered 4, each with private bathroom. Rinalda had 12 bathrooms total. Most American homes still used shared bathrooms. The convenience was unprecedented in southern estates. The basement contained service spaces and mechanical systems. The heating plant used coal-fired boilers, producing steam distributed through radiators. The laundry occupied substantial space. Food storage areas included refrigerated rooms. The wine cellar could hold several hundred bottles. Staff work areas filled remaining basement space. The mechanical systems represented the most advanced technology available. The heating system maintained comfortable temperatures throughout winter. The electrical system provided outlets and lighting in every room. The telephone system connected rooms internally and linked to Winston-Salem exchanges. The kitchen used gas ranges and electric refrigeration. Hot water was available throughout the house. The self-sufficiency infrastructure extended beyond the mansion. The power plant generated electricity for the entire estate. 2 generators provided redundancy. The plant employed 2 full-time engineers. Coal deliveries arrived weekly by rail. The operation was continuous. The water system drew from deep wells. Electric pumps moved water to elevated storage tanks. Gravity provided distribution pressure. The system included filtration. Water quality exceeded Winston-Salem municipal standards. The entire system operated independently of city infrastructure. The dairy barns housed 40 Guernsey cattle by 1920. The herd had been assembled from breeding stock purchased at premium prices. The dairy produced milk, butter, cream, and cheese. Production exceeded household consumption. Surplus was sold to local markets. The operation required approximately 12 full-time workers. The greenhouse complex covered approximately 30,000 square feet. Multiple connected structures allowed different climate zones. A palm house maintained tropical conditions year-round. Orchid houses provided precise temperature and humidity control. Production houses grew roses and carnations. Vegetables, including tomatoes, grew year-round. The greenhouses required 8 full-time workers. The vegetable gardens occupied approximately 10 acres. Production rotated seasonally. Spring brought lettuce and peas. Summer produced tomatoes and beans. Fall yielded cabbage and turnips. The garden supplied the mansion kitchen and workers' families. 4 full-time gardeners managed planting and harvesting. The lake covered approximately 10 acres. It provided water for irrigation. It supported recreation, including swimming and boating. The dam required periodic maintenance. 1 full-time worker managed lake maintenance. The golf course occupied approximately 80 acres. Charles Barton Keene had laid out a 9-hole course. Maintaining the course required 4 full-time workers. The Reynolds family and guests had exclusive use. Workers could not play the course. The worker village housed approximately 100 families when fully occupied. Housing was segregated by race. White workers occupied 40 houses clustered near the dairy. Black workers lived in 60 smaller houses situated farther from central facilities. Both white and black housing included electricity, running water, and indoor plumbing. The white houses were larger, with better construction. The school served white workers' children exclusively. The building contained 2 classrooms. 1 teacher handled younger children. Another taught older students. The school operated 9 months annually. Black workers' children attended schools in Winston-Salem or did not attend school at all. When complete, Reynolds employed approximately 300 workers. The mansion household staff numbered about 20. Agricultural operations employed approximately 80 workers. Grounds maintenance required 30 workers. Dairy operations used 12 workers. Greenhouses employed 8. Infrastructure maintenance needed 20 workers. The wage structure remained hierarchical. White supervisors earned $20 to $30 weekly. Skilled white workers received $12 to $18. Unskilled white laborers earned $8 to $12. Black workers performing manual labor received $5 to $8 weekly. Women working as domestic staff earned $6 to $10 weekly. The total cost of building Reynolds exceeded $5 million in period currency. Adjusted for inflation, that represents approximately $130 million today. The estate was among the most expensive private projects in the South during the 1,910 seconds. Only Biltmore estate in Asheville had cost more. The comparison mattered to Katharine. She had wanted to be mentioned in the same breath as Vanderbilt. The expenditure achieved that goal. Reynolds was a kingdom in miniature. Katharine Reynolds ruled it alone. The operational complexity of Reynolds required coordination that approached military precision. Every department operated on schedules that intersected with others. The dairy workers' morning milking schedule determined when fresh milk reached the mansion kitchen for breakfast service. The greenhouse production cycles aligned with Katharine's entertaining calendar, ensuring fresh flowers were available for events. The laundry operated around the clock during busy social seasons, when guest linens required constant turnover. The estate's self-sufficiency was more aspiration than reality in practice. While the power plant generated electricity and wells provided water, numerous supplies required constant procurement from Winston-Salem suppliers. Specialized foods, wines, household goods, and equipment parts arrived by wagon and later by truck on regular schedules. The infrastructure for self-sufficiency existed. The complete independence Katharine imagined never fully materialized because maintaining it would have been even more expensive than the already substantial costs. The symbolic importance of self-sufficiency exceeded its practical value. Katharine wanted Reynolds to demonstrate that a southern estate could function independently without depending on northern or urban resources. The power plant, water system, and agricultural operations announced that the Reynolds family possessed resources adequate to create their own infrastructure. The point was making a statement about family status rather than achieving actual independence from external systems. The agricultural operations generated modest revenue but operated at substantial losses when full costs, including labor, maintenance, and capital expenses, were calculated. The dairy sold surplus milk and cream. The gardens provided vegetables beyond household needs. But these sales covered perhaps 20% of the costs required to maintain the operations. The remaining 80% was subsidized by tobacco wealth. The farms existed to demonstrate progressive agricultural methods and family status rather than to generate profit. Katharine understood this. The operations were justified by their symbolic value, not their economic returns. Chapter 5. The Completed Estate. Reynolds functioned as a small company town with Katharine Reynolds as both employer and sovereign. The estate operated according to rules she established. Workers who violated those rules faced immediate consequences. The arrangement was feudal in practice. The household staff maintained the mansion according to exacting standards. The butler supervised all domestic operations. He hired and fired staff, managed schedules, and ensured service met expectations. The cook managed kitchen operations. 3 maids cleaned the house daily. A laundress handled washing and ironing. The chauffeur maintained automobiles. Each position had defined responsibilities. The daily routine began before sunrise. Kitchen staff arrived at 5:30, starting fires and beginning breakfast preparation. Maids followed at 6, opening curtains and tidying spaces. By the time Katharine descended at 8, the house was operating at full efficiency. Breakfast service was formal. Food was prepared in the basement kitchen and delivered to the dining room. The butler, or senior maid, served each course. Katharine's preferences were known and anticipated. She drank coffee, never tea. Toast was cut diagonally. Eggs were prepared soft-boiled, exactly 3 minutes. Deviation resulted in reprimands. Repeated failures resulted in dismissal. After breakfast, Katharine conducted estate business from the library. The estate manager reported daily on operations, maintenance needs, and staffing issues. Financial records required review. Correspondence needed responses. The management occupied 2 to 3 hours most mornings. Luncheon was less formal but followed structured service. Katharine often took the meal in the morning room. The menu varied but typically included lighter items. Afternoon tea occurred at 4, following English customs. Dinner was the day's formal meal. Service began at 7 precisely. The dining room was set with proper linens, china, crystal, and silver. Multiple courses were served according to French service style. Soup came first, then fish, then meat with vegetables, then salad, then dessert. Wine accompanied appropriate courses. The meal lasted approximately 90 minutes. The household staff worked substantially longer hours. Kitchen workers began at 5:30 and worked until evening dishes were finished, typically after 8. Maids worked from 6 to 7 or later. The butler's hours extended past midnight when the family entertained. Days off were infrequent. 1 full day monthly was standard. The wages reflected subordinate position. The butler earned approximately $15 weekly. The cook received $12. Maids earned $8 to $10. These wages were paid in addition to housing and meals. Staff lived in quarters on the 3rd floor or in separate housing. They ate meals prepared using ingredients not quite good enough for family consumption. Staff members who lost positions also lost housing immediately. No grace period existed. Dismissal meant immediate departure. The threat kept workers compliant. The agricultural workers endured different but equally exploitative conditions. Dairy workers began at 4 each morning for milking. The cows required milking twice daily. Morning milking took approximately 3 hours. Workers returned at 4:00 the afternoon. Between sessions, they cleaned equipment, mucked stalls, and maintained facilities. Field workers planted, cultivated, and harvested crops according to seasonal cycles. Spring planting meant 12-hour days. Summer cultivation required constant weeding. Fall harvest demanded intensive labor. Winter provided minimal relief. Greenhouse workers tended plants year-round in humid conditions. The work required careful attention. Killing valuable specimens through negligence resulted in dismissal. Workers labored in temperatures often exceeding 90 degrees in summer. Grounds maintenance workers mowed grass, raked leaves, trimmed hedges. Golf course maintenance alone required 4 workers during growing season. Fairways needed mowing twice weekly. Greens required daily attention. The racial hierarchy governing operations was absolute. Black workers could not supervise white workers. Skilled black craftsmen earned less than unskilled white laborers. Black workers used separate entrances, ate in separate facilities, could not use the same bathrooms as white workers. Housing in the worker village replicated segregation physically. White workers lived in houses clustered together. Black workers occupied a separate section. Children played in separate areas. Women working on the estate occupied a precarious position. White women worked primarily as domestic servants. Black women worked as field laborers. All women earned substantially less than men. Sexual harassment by supervisors was routine. Women who refused advances risked dismissal. The workers who maintained Reynolda lived lives invisible to guests. They rose before dawn and worked past dusk. They made the estate function while remaining deliberately unseen. Katharine expanded her social ambitions after the estate was completed. She began entertaining within months. Dinner parties introduced Winston-Salem families to the property. Guest lists were carefully constructed. Each event was choreographed to impress. The dinners announced refined taste. Menus featured multiple courses. French wines accompanied appropriate courses. Katharine had hired consultants from northern cities to train her staff. The goal was demonstrating that southern estates could match northern sophistication. She expanded entertaining beyond Winston-Salem, inviting families from Charlotte, Raleigh, and Greensboro. She cultivated relationships with Virginia tobacco families. Old money families were not easily impressed. Katharine's response was consistent invitation and impeccable hospitality. She supported cultural institutions generously. Winston-Salem lacked concert halls and museums. Katharine donated funds to establish a symphony orchestra. She supported an arts association. She contributed to library expansions. Education became another focus. She donated substantially to Salem College. She established scholarships. She funded building expansions. The relationship benefited both parties. Her children's education received enormous attention. Mary and Nancy attended exclusive boarding schools. Richard Jr. attended preparatory schools designed to feed students into Ivy League universities. Zachary would follow the same path. By 1923, Katharine had established Reynolda as one of the notable estates in the South. Her children were being educated at prestigious schools. Her philanthropic work was recognized publicly. But she remained fundamentally the wife of a tobacco manufacturer. Old money never forgot it. In early 1924, Katharine Reynolds began exhibiting symptoms her doctors could not diagnose. The illness began gradually in February 1924. Katharine experienced fatigue that seemed disproportionate to her activities. She consulted her personal physician in Winston-Salem, who found nothing definitive. She attributed the symptoms to exhaustion from managing the estate and her active social schedule. But the fatigue persisted and worsened. By March, additional symptoms appeared: abdominal discomfort that came and went without clear pattern, loss of appetite that resulted in noticeable weight loss. Katharine was a disciplined woman who maintained regular routines. The disruption to her normal patterns was itself alarming. She consulted specialists in Richmond, who conducted examinations but reached no clear diagnosis. In April, the symptoms intensified. The abdominal pain became sharper and more frequent. Nausea made eating difficult. Her weight dropped dramatically. She consulted specialists in Biltmore, traveling there despite feeling increasingly unwell. They proposed various theories but offered no definitive explanation or effective treatment. By May, Katharine was spending more time resting. She continued managing estate business from her bedroom when she could no longer work comfortably in the library. The staff noticed the change with concern but said nothing. In June, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Family members were summoned. Her children returned from school. Everyone understood the situation. Chapter 6. Life at Reynolds. Katharine Reynolds died on the 15th of July, 1924, at Reynolds after an illness that had progressed over several months. The official death certificate listed influenza complicated by intestinal infection. She was 44 years old. Her 4 children became wards of family members and trustees. Mary was 18, Richard Jr. was 16, Nancy was 14, Zachary was 12. They would inherit substantial wealth when they came of age. The Reynolds children returned to Reynolds during school vacations and holidays. The estate provided familiar surroundings in connection to parents both now dead. Mary assumed some responsibility for maintaining family cohesion. She was thrust into a surrogate mother role she had not sought. The trustees managing the estate maintained operations at levels approximating what had existed under Katharine. The agricultural programs continued. The dairy herd was maintained. Greenhouses produced flowers and vegetables. Grounds were kept in acceptable condition. The mansion was staffed adequately, though at somewhat reduced levels. The children used Reynolds primarily during summers. They invited friends from boarding schools. They hosted parties. The estate became recreational property rather than permanent residence. None of the children lived there full-time. Mary moved to New York. Richard Jr. attended Yale. Nancy and Zachary continued at boarding schools. The costs were substantial. Operating the estate required approximately $200,000 annually in mid-1920s currency. The income generated from dairy sales and surplus agricultural produce covered perhaps 10% of expenses. The remainder came from trust income derived from Reynolds tobacco stock. The social functions that had been Reynolds' purpose occurred less frequently. The children hosted gatherings, but not with the strategic intent their mother had brought. The estate became a playground rather than a stage for establishing family legacy. The staff who maintained Reynolds continued working under conditions largely unchanged. Wages remained low. Hours remained long. The hierarchies persisted. Black workers still earned less than white workers. Women earned less than men. The housing was still segregated. The school still served only white children. By 1928, questions about Reynolds' future were emerging. Richard Jr. was approaching his 21st birthday. The trustees needed to determine whether maintaining the estate made sense. The annual operating costs were difficult to justify for property used primarily during summer vacation. The mansion required constant maintenance. The mechanical systems were aging. The agricultural operations lost money. But selling Reynolds meant abandoning what R., J., and Katharine had created. The estate represented family legacy. Disposing of it would acknowledge that the vision had failed. The trustees were reluctant to make that decision without input from the children. Richard Jr.'s inheritance included substantial Reynolds tobacco stock, real estate holdings, cash assets, and his share of Reynolds. The tobacco stock alone generated annual income exceeding what most Americans earned over lifetimes. He would never need employment. Reynolds was one small piece of enormous wealth. By 1936, the estate's operating costs exceeded income by margins that could not be ignored. The Reynolds heirs were approaching adulthood. Decisions needed to be made. Richard Jr. faced those decisions first. He was practical and unsentimental. The estate had been his parents' dream, not his own. The solution he devised was donating the property to an educational institution. In 1946, after delays caused by World War II, Richard Jr. finalized donation of the mansion and approximately 20 surrounding acres to Wake Forest University. The university was seeking to relocate to Winston-Salem. Reynolds could serve institutional purposes. Richard Jr. retained some acreage and sold other portions. The worker village was sold to a developer. The agricultural land was sold to local farmers. The estate that had covered 1,067 acres was dismantled systematically. The staff who had maintained Reynolds found themselves unemployed. Some had worked on the estate for decades. They had tended gardens, milked cows, cleaned the mansion. Now they were dismissed with minimal notice and no severance beyond final wages. The workers who had made Reynolds function were discarded. The dairy herd was sold at auction. The greenhouses were emptied. The power plant was shut down. The lake remained, but without management. The golf course reverted to grassland. Everything that had required constant human effort began returning to natural state. By late 1946, Reynolds had transformed from a living estate maintained by hundreds of workers into property awaiting determination of future use by an institution that had accepted it primarily to maintain good relations with a donor family. The kingdom Katharine had built was subdivided and dispersed. What remained was a house without purpose and a university uncertain what to do with property it had accepted, because refusing would have insulted the Reynolds family, whose continued support mattered more than the property itself. The vision that had consumed Katharine's final years had lasted barely 2 decades before economic reality forced its dismantling. Chapter 7. The Decline. Wake Forest University took possession of Reynolds in 1946 with no clear plan for its use. The institution had accepted the property because refusing would have insulted the Reynolds family. The university would determine appropriate use eventually. Initial proposals involved converting the mansion to administrative offices. The space could accommodate multiple departments, but the location was problematic. Administrators needed proximity to campus. Reynolds was 5 miles away. The distance would waste time and complicate coordination. The idea was abandoned. Alternative proposals suggested using Reynolds as a president's residence. The mansion was impressive enough for hosting donors and important guests, but the operational costs were prohibitive. Maintaining the building would cost far more than the university's budget could accommodate. That proposal was rejected. Converting the mansion to student housing was considered briefly. The building could accommodate 40 to 50 students in dormitory arrangements. But renovations would be extensive and expensive. The mansion's layout was designed for residential luxury, not institutional efficiency. Bathrooms would need to be added. Heating systems would require upgrading. Fire safety systems would need installation. The project would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The idea went nowhere. By 1950, the university had made no significant use of Reynolds. The building sat largely empty. Minimum heating was maintained during winter. Otherwise, the property was essentially abandoned. The grounds received minimal maintenance. The gardens overgrew. The estate was deteriorating visibly. The university's financial situation worsened throughout the 1,950 seconds. Enrollments grew faster than revenue. New facilities were needed on main campus. Every dollar was competed for fiercely. Maintaining a property no one used was impossible to justify. Reynolds became viewed as a burden rather than asset. Demolition was proposed in 1958. The mansion was deteriorating. It served no purpose. The land had value. Selling the site to developers would generate revenue. The 20 acres could be subdivided into residential lots. The university could recover some value from property that was costing money constantly. The proposal advanced to serious consideration. Community opposition emerged immediately. Local residents valued Reynolds as historic landmark. The estate represented Winston-Salem's tobacco heritage. Destroying the mansion would eliminate irreplaceable architecture. Historic preservation advocates formed committees. They lobbied administrators. They generated newspaper coverage. They argued that demolishing Reynolds would be cultural vandalism. But preservation advocates offered no solutions to the fundamental problem. Someone needed to pay for maintaining the property. The university could not afford it. The Reynolds family had donated the property but provided no endowment for operations. Historic significance did not change financial reality. Unless someone provided funding, demolition remained the most practical option. The stalemate persisted through the early 1,960 seconds. The mansion continued deteriorating. Roof leaks allowed water damage. Windows rattled loose. Plaster cracked and fell. The heating system failed repeatedly. Each winter risked frozen pipes and catastrophic damage. The building was approaching the point where restoration would be impossible. By 1964, the mansion had been effectively abandoned for nearly 2 decades. The university maintained minimal heat. Otherwise, Reynolds sat empty. The gardens overgrew. The greenhouses collapsed. The power plant had been shut down for years. The estate that had employed 300 workers now employed 1 part-time caretaker. The decline was nearly complete. Restoration would require enormous investment. Demolition remained the default trajectory unless circumstances changed dramatically and soon. The building that Katharine Reynolds had spent millions creating and years perfecting was rotting into ruin because no one could determine what to do with a mansion designed for purposes that no longer existed in a world that had moved beyond the Gilded Age assumptions that had justified its construction. Chapter 8. The Institutional Years. Mary Reynolds Babcock had left Winston-Salem decades earlier and built a life elsewhere. She married Charles H. Babcock. They lived in New York for many years. She maintained connections to North Carolina but had not focused on Reynolda after the estate passed out of family control. But she watched Reynolda's decline with growing concern. The property her mother had built was being allowed to deteriorate. The university clearly had no intention of using it. The building was rotting. Eventually it would be demolished. Mary understood that historic buildings once lost could never be recovered. Her brother, Zachary Smith Reynolds, had established the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation before his death in 1932. The foundation supported charitable causes in North Carolina. Mary served on the foundation board. She began advocating in the early 1960 seconds for using foundation funds to preserve Reynolda. The property could be restored and opened to the public as a museum. Other board members were skeptical initially. Reynolda would require substantial investment. Operating costs would continue indefinitely. The property served no urgent social need. Foundation funds could accomplish more supporting education or health care. Preserving a mansion seemed self-indulgent. But Mary persisted. She argued that historic preservation had legitimate value. Reynolda could become a museum and cultural center serving the entire community. It could generate tourism revenue for Winston-Salem. It could teach future generations about the region's tobacco history. The benefits justified the investment. By 1965, Mary had secured sufficient support. The Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation committed funds estimated at $2 million to restore Reynolda and establish it as a museum. Wake Forest University would transfer the property to a new nonprofit organization. The restoration would be comprehensive. The grounds would be restored. The building would be open to public visitation. The decision rescued Reynolda from demolition that would have occurred within a few years. The university had been moving steadily toward tearing down the mansion. The building was becoming dangerous. Deferred maintenance had accumulated beyond reasonable expense. Mary's determination saved the estate her mother had created. Restoration planning began immediately. Architects evaluated the mansion's condition. Structural engineers assessed repairs. Historic preservation specialists documented original features. The scope was substantial. The roof required complete replacement. Windows needed restoration. Plaster needed repair. Mechanical systems were obsolete. Electrical wiring did not meet codes. Plumbing required extensive work. The cost estimates approached $2 million. The foundation approved the expenditure. Work began in 1966. Contractors removed damaged materials carefully. Skilled craftsmen replicated woodwork and decorative elements. Modern systems were installed with attention to minimizing visual impact. The restoration took several years. The mansion reopened to the public in 1967 as Reynolda House Museum of American Art. The building displayed the foundation's collection of American paintings and decorative arts. Visitors could tour rooms decorated with period furniture. Educational programs taught regional history and art appreciation. The estate that had nearly faced demolition became a celebrated cultural institution that would serve the public for decades to come while telling a carefully curated version of the Reynolds family story. Chapter 9. The Restoration. Restoration crews beginning work in 1965 found a building that had deteriorated significantly. The roof leaked in multiple locations. Water damage had destroyed plaster ceilings. Window sashes had rotted. Paint was peeling. Floors were warped. The heating system had failed. Pipes had frozen and burst. Electrical wiring was dangerous. The building required extensive repairs. The restoration philosophy emphasized returning the mansion to its appearance during Katharine Reynolds' lifetime. Rooms would be furnished with period-appropriate pieces. Colors would match original paint analysis. The goal was creating an authentic representation of early 20th century wealthy domesticity. But decisions were required about what to preserve and what to change. The original kitchen was obsolete. Should it be restored to original appearance or converted to museum support functions? The third-floor servants' quarters had housed staff under uncomfortable conditions. Should those rooms be restored or converted to administrative offices? The restoration team chose to focus on public and family spaces. Formal rooms on the first floor were restored meticulously. Original woodwork was repaired, plaster details were replicated, floors were refinished. Second-floor bedrooms became galleries for displaying American art. The third floor was converted entirely to administrative offices and storage. The small rooms that had housed servants were combined into larger spaces suitable for museum operations. No effort was made to interpret how servants lived or worked. The decision was practical. Office space was needed. The choice also avoided confronting uncomfortable realities about labor exploitation. The basement followed similar logic. Mechanical spaces were updated with modern systems. Storage rooms served museum needs. The spaces where servants had worked were adapted for contemporary functions. Original equipment was removed. What had been visible evidence of domestic service disappeared. Outside, the grounds restoration focused on ornamental gardens immediately surrounding the mansion. The formal gardens were replanted according to historic photographs. Paths were repaired. Hedges were reestablished. But the broader estate received minimal attention. The greenhouses were demolished. The structures had collapsed partially. Restoration would have been extremely expensive. No compelling use existed. The foundations were removed. The sites were graded and planted with grass. The greenhouses that had grown orchids vanished completely. The dairy barns survived, but were converted to other uses. One barn became retail space for a museum shop. Another housed a restaurant. The conversions required substantial interior modifications. Original stalls and equipment were removed. Function was sacrificed for adaptive reuse. The power plant building was retained as visual landmark, but not restored internally. The structure was sound. The exterior brick was repointed, but the interior machinery had been sold for scrap. The building stood as architectural feature without functional role. Reynolds House opened as a museum in 1967. The restoration was praised widely. Historic preservationists celebrated saving an important regional landmark. The museum attracted substantial visitation immediately. Educational programs served local schools. The foundation's investment appeared vindicated. But what had been preserved was selective. Formal spaces, used by wealthy family, were restored carefully. Spaces used by servants were converted or ignored. Agricultural operations were represented minimally or eliminated. The worker village had been sold and demolished years earlier. The museum told the story of Reynolds' family luxury while omitting the labor exploitation that made luxury possible. The choices made during restoration ensured that future visitors would see beauty without understanding the full cost of creating it. Chapter 10. The Legacy. Reynolds House is remembered today as one of North Carolina's most significant historic estates. The museum welcomes approximately 60,000 visitors annually. The American art collection is valued at tens of millions of dollars. Educational programs serve thousands of school children yearly. Historic preservation organizations cite Reynolds as successful adaptive reuse. The interpretation presented to visitors emphasizes architectural achievement, progressive era ideals, and Reynolds family philanthropy. Guided tours describe the mansion's Georgian revival design. They explain self-sufficiency infrastructure. They note the model worker village. They praise Katharine Reynolds as forward-thinking employer. The narrative is almost entirely celebratory. What the standard interpretation omits is systematic exploitation that built and maintained Reynolds. The worker deaths during construction go unmentioned. No markers identify where men fell to their deaths. The brutal working conditions are not discussed. The child labor receives no attention. The sexual harassment women workers endured is never acknowledged. The racial segregation that governed every aspect of operations is noted only obliquely, if at all. The tobacco wealth that funded Reynolds is addressed carefully. Exhibits mention that R.J. Reynolds founded Reynolds Tobacco Company. They note that tobacco products generated the fortune. They avoid confronting what that means. Tobacco is the most addictive legal drug in human history. Reynolds Tobacco spent decades marketing products designed to create lifelong addiction. Millions died from tobacco-related diseases, while Reynolds' heirs lived on wealth those deaths generated. The worker village is gone entirely. The houses were sold and demolished. No reconstruction exists showing how workers lived. No interpretation explains that white workers and black workers occupied segregated facilities. No exhibit describes wage differentials based on race and gender. The school building is gone. The fact that black children were excluded from education is omitted. The sanitization is deliberate. Museums serving general audiences avoid confronting wealthy donors with uncomfortable truths. Reynolds was built by exploited labor from wealth generated by selling addictive drugs. Those facts are documented. But stating them directly would offend people whose support the museum requires. Other Gilded Age estates handle their dark histories with varying degrees of honesty. Some acknowledge labor exploitation directly. Others, like Reynolds, focus almost entirely on architectural achievement and family narrative. The pattern reflects broader American reluctance to confront how wealth was actually generated during periods we prefer to remember as golden ages. The physical remnants that survive tell partial story. The mansion displays how wealthy family lived, but the spaces where workers labored are converted or gone. The third-floor servants' quarters are offices now. The basement service areas house museum functions. The greenhouses are demolished. The worker village is obliterated. The evidence of how the estate actually functioned has been systematically erased. The workers who died building Reynolds were never counted. Construction records mention accidents without documenting victims' names. No memorial honors their sacrifice. The workers simply vanished from history. The staff who maintained Reynolds left no memoirs. Their daily routines, their grievances, their aspirations are unknown. History remembers Katharine Reynolds in detail. It barely remembers the maids who cleaned her mansion, the cooks who prepared her meals, or the gardeners who maintained her landscapes. The racial segregation that defined Reynolds' operations is the most conspicuous omission. Jim Crow laws governed North Carolina throughout the estate's operational life. Reynolds replicated those hierarchies. Black workers earned half what white workers received. They lived in inferior housing. Their children were denied education. These policies were foundational to how the estate operated. The fortune that paid for everything came from manufacturing tobacco products that killed millions. R.J. Reynolds built his company through aggressive marketing. Reynolds Tobacco created brands designed to maximize addictiveness. The company fought regulation and suppressed research, documenting tobacco dangers. The wealth that funded Reynolds derived directly from addicting people to cigarettes. This fundamental fact is rarely emphasized. The mansion is magnificent. The architecture is first-rate design, executed with quality materials. The gardens are beautifully maintained. The art collection is genuinely significant. None of these things are false. They are simply incomplete. The magnificence and the darkness coexisted. They were inseparable. Katharine Reynolds was an ambitious woman who built something remarkable within constraints of her time. She also operated according to racial hierarchies we now recognize as morally indefensible. She provided better working conditions than many employers, while still exploiting workers systematically. She supported education for some while excluding others, based on race. She was complicated. The question museums like Reynolds face is whether institutions built on exploitation can be redeemed through public access, or whether the original sin remains embedded in the foundations. Opening a mansion to visitors does not change how it was built. Converting a private estate to cultural center does not compensate workers who were exploited. Beautiful architecture does not justify the suffering required to produce it. Reynolds offers no answer. It simply stands, beautiful and haunted, asking visitors to decide what they are looking at, a testament to American ambition and regional prosperity. Or a monument to tobacco wealth and labor exploitation, a progressive era ideal of enlightened management, or a Jim Crow estate that encoded racial hierarchy in every brick. The building holds both truths. History demands we acknowledge them together. The workers who built Reynolds received no share of glory. They died or aged out and were replaced. Their children inherited poverty, not estates. The wealth they created flowed upward to people who already possessed wealth beyond measure. The system that produced this outcome was designed deliberately. Reynolds stands as beautiful evidence of how that system worked.